Now on to our last story. Africa, once known as the cradle of humankind, today is seen as the land of the future. Rich in both natural and human resources, in the past few years, the region has turned into a hotspot of geopolitical rivalry between world powers. It is one of the fastest growing regions in the world, and this year too, it has managed to maintain its growth momentum. But not without challenges. From military takeovers to the rise of the youth, from worsening debt to the tectonic political shifts, 2024 has been a mixed bag for the continent of Africa. Our next report brings you the 5 biggest headlines from the continent this year.
Africa, the second largest continent, home to over 1.5 billion people. Best known for its enormous diversity and the richest wildlife. In recent years, Africa has transformed itself into one of the fastest growing regions in the world. And throughout the year, it has managed to maintain that growth momentum. Despite facing multiple shocks, Africa's economy has largely remained resilient. The region has also emerged as a major hotspot of geopolitical rivalry between the big economies. 2024 has been a mixed bag for Africa, from elections to political instability. From multiple summits that put Africa on the world stage to global security challenges. From rising debt to worsening conflicts. It has been a year of cautious hope, to say the least. Let's take a look at the 5 biggest headlines from Africa in the year 2024. Starting with a few facts. Did you know that 7 in 10 Africans are under the age of 30? The continent has a median age of 19, the youngest in the world. And these young Africans have been on the march. It has been a year of youth-led protests across the continent. The young ones made sure they put their aging leaders on notice. Their message was clear: change or go. It all started with Kenya. In June, the country's Gen Z set an example for the entire world as they poured out onto the streets in massive numbers, demanding that the William Ruto government withdraw a finance bill.
Ruto must go! Ruto must go! Ruto must go! Ruto must go!
This included a slew of higher taxes. And it's not just the bill, they wanted the president to go as well. Key Kenyan cities turned into war zones. The sound of bullets echoed in the streets that were engulfed in smoke from tear gas shells. The protesters even stormed the parliament. The Kenyan security forces unleashed a fierce crackdown, but the protesters did not flinch. President William Ruto was eventually forced to give in. He succumbed to public pressure and yielded to some demands made by the people.
I concede, and therefore I will not sign the 2024 finance bill.
But the anger did not let up. The Ruto government continues to be on thin ice. Emboldened by Kenya, young demonstrators in neighboring Uganda used social media to organize an anti-corruption protest. Despite police excesses, dozens marched in the capital Kampala. They told President Yoweri Museveni that he was messing with the wrong generation. More than 70 activists were arrested in Uganda. Gen Z from Kenya and Uganda in East Africa became an inspiration for the youth in West Africa's Nigeria. In August, the Nigerian youth in Abuja and Lagos protested against poor governance under the Bola Tinubu administration and the worsening cost of living crisis. But Nigerian authorities managed to crush these protests within days. The protesters were met with mass arrests and a fierce crackdown. dozens were charged with treason and inciting a military coup. The second big headline: rejection of liberation-era parties. Africa's spirited young population also led a political revolution. Southern Africa witnessed a disruption of the grand old liberation-era parties. These are the parties that had been relying on their goodwill of fighting colonialism to stay in power. But for the young Africans, that goodwill and a history lesson played on loop weren't enough. Jobs, accountability, freedom of speech, human rights, they want their governments to deliver. First, it was South Africa. The continent's powerhouse voted in its general elections in the month of May, and the result brought a seismic shift in the country's political landscape. The ruling African National Congress, which was once led by Nelson Mandela, lost its majority for the first time since the end of apartheid 3 decades ago. It was brought down to 40% of the vote, and it was forced to form a coalition government with a leading opposition party, the Democratic Alliance. This party has long been perceived as one that promotes the interests of white South Africans. In diamond-rich Botswana, voters rejected the ruling Botswana Democratic Party after 58 years in power. The BDP has been in power since the country's independence in 1966. Come 2024, the party bagged only 4 parliamentary seats. Poor economic growth and high unemployment dented the grand old party's popularity. In Mozambique, though the ruling Frelimo Party won the re-election, extending its 49-year rule, a staggering 56% of the 17 million eligible voters abstained. The results have been widely disputed. The October election results have fueled intense clashes between the police and protesters. A large part of the country's youth supported the independent opposition candidate Venancio Mondlane, who claims that the vote was rigged. He called for nationwide protests, but the demonstrations were met with tear gas and live ammunition. At least 260 people, including children, have been killed in the protests against the disputed results. The West must go. This has been the slogan of the hour in West Africa, especially in the junta-ruled states, and this is the third biggest headline of the year from Africa. On September 15th, the United States completed its military withdrawal from Niger. The decision was not Washington's, but Niamey's. Following the footsteps of neighboring junta-ruled states like Burkina Faso and Mali, Niger too gave the boot to the West. In March of this year, Washington was asked to withdraw all its troops from Niger. Earlier, France had been asked to withdraw from its former colonies Mali and Burkina Faso. The French forces completed their withdrawal from Mali on August 15th. Burkina Faso had already given them a 1-month ultimatum at the end of 2023. The United States increased its military footprint in Africa after the September 11th attacks to fight Islamist terrorism. Whereas France, the former colonial power of many African countries, continued to enjoy trust to tackle security and other challenges. Military bases in the Sahel region helped the West conduct intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance activities. But after the juntas took over in West Africa's Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, they asked the West to withdraw their troops. Even Chad has reportedly requested a US troop withdrawal. The Sahel has had a reputation for long-running insurgencies. The junta leaders said that over the years, the West failed to counter this challenge and did little to improve the security situation. This massive snub by West Africa has almost led to the collapse of Western influence in the Sahel region. This extends from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the Red Sea. But as the security situation continues to deteriorate, the junta rulers of West Africa have turned to a new partner, Russia. The anti-West movement quickly turned into a pro-Russia wave. Russian flags were proudly displayed during protests against the French and US forces. Challenging the Western hegemony, Russia sought strategic partnerships in the Sahel region. Moscow expanded its footprint through its Wagner mercenary group, which was later disbanded and renamed the Africa Corps. It has solidified partnerships and expanded engagement in military, security, and diplomatic initiatives. This further diminishes the West's future in West Africa. The fourth biggest headline from Africa this year is Sudan Civil War and the role of outsiders. The Northeast African nation has been devastated by an unrelenting war since April 2023. On one side, you have Sudan's army, headed by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. On the other side, you have the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, headed by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemedti. Both sides have refused to back down. The United Nations has repeatedly accused foreign players of prolonging the war in Sudan, making it harder for the country to find peace. Several countries have been supporting the two warring parties with arms, ammunition, and finance. The countries include the United Arab Emirates, Russia, and Libya. All of them have been accused of supporting the paramilitary RSF. Meanwhile, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iran reportedly aid the Sudanese army. This violates a UN arms embargo against Sudan. So, how are these arms entering Sudan and reaching the warring parties? Sudan is surrounded by major arms trafficking hubs. Weapons and ammunition are smuggled in through countries like Libya, Chad, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Uganda. But it is the United Arab Emirates that has emerged as the foreign player most invested in the war. A United Nations team tasked with monitoring an arms embargo on Darfur backed allegations that the UAE was funneling weapons to the RSF through Chad. Abu Dhabi has, however, denied all allegations, calling them ludicrous. While the war trade continues to boom, the humanitarian situation in Sudan is worsening with each passing day. The international community has been failing to address it. The civil war is inching closer to its 2-year mark. Sudan has become the center of one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Over 20,000 people have been killed, around 9 million have been displaced, and around 25 million, which is almost half the population of Sudan, are in dire need of humanitarian aid. And still, the prospects for peace remain elusive. The fifth headline from Africa comes all the way from Equatorial Guinea. It's a small nation on the west coast of Central Africa. This made big headlines around the world over a high-profile sex tape scandal. In November, over 400 sex tapes involving a high-ranking Equatorial Guinean civil servant made rounds on social media. The scandal surrounded Baltazar Ebang Ngonga, the director of the country's National Financial Investigation Agency. Authorities found around 400 sex videos of him and multiple women on his computer. This included his brother's wife, the president's cousin and sister, the wife of the Director General of Police, and the spouses of over 20 ministers. Ngonga's office was the site of many of these sexual encounters. It's not clear if the sexual activities with the women were consensual, or if any of the women had lodged formal complaints against him. Some reports say that these scenes were filmed without consent. Some of the videos were leaked on social media, prompting shock and outrage across the country. The sheer size and the profiles of the people involved pushed the government into hysteria. The president, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, who has been ruling Equatorial Guinea since 1982, panicked as well. The government swung into action to curb the spread of the videos. First, they cut down the internet. Then, Ngonga was suspended while a probe of the scandal continued. The government also said that all those appearing in the sex tapes would be suspended. Those responsible for securing the buildings in which the videos were allegedly filmed would be reprimanded for failing to do their jobs. The government also ordered a crackdown on sex in government offices. It decided to install security cameras in all offices and stepped up security. While scandals like this, involving politicians and high-profile officials, have emerged before, this case in Equatorial Guinea was one of the biggest incidents to shake the world.